This is the panel on Dr. Timothy Leary. This gentleman here, a figure of the past that many of you may remember. The basic premise of it is that Dr. Leary came to the San Diego Comic Convention for some strange reason in 1976. And we're going to talk about that, but we're also going to talk about the doctor in general because several of our panelists knew him and worked with him in other capacities. So we're going to start this, we're going to commence this by me introducing everybody. This is George Clayton Johnson, writer and visionary. Wendy All, who is the reimaginator of Cafe Frankenstein and also a member of the San Diego Comic-Con committee in 1976, and who met Dr. Leary at that time. Dave Clark, also a member of fandom and associate of the Comic-Con, who also was there when Leary was there. Pete Bonchali, a very artist, director, creator, and someone who worked with Dr. Leary on Neurocomics. Is that the correct title?
Yes.
Yes.
Do we get free samples?
You
What?
can have a glass of water at your own risk.
I just want a sugar cube.
It may come in saccharin form, but whatever. I'd like to start with my memory of Dr. Leary, which is really an odd story. And it involves a radio personality named Gabriel Wisdom. Some of you may remember. San Diego on KGB FM. Now, Gabriel Wisdom is a financial commentator and has syndicated programs about finance. I think has had some association with the Marketplace show on NPR at one time. But back then he was a music DJ. And when he was broadcasting in San Diego, one of his listeners was Dr. Timothy Leary, who happened to be in town because he was incarcerated in the San Diego facility downtown. And he reached out to Gabriel while he was still doing his time, and they became friends. And Tim was paroled in 1976. And once he got out, he started collaborating with Gabriel. They had a radio show in mind about expanded intelligence and futurism. Gabriel was also a supporter of the Comic-Con, and he used to appear at the Comic-Con as the mighty Thor. In Hawaii, he had been on television. He was a children's host, I think. He had a Thor costume, and he would come and host our masquerades. He's a good friend of the Comic-Con, good advisor to us. He put Timothy Leary together with the Comic-Con. And in the process of that, he put me together with Tim. They envisioned a role for me in this show they were cooking up. And forgive me if the details are sketchy because they were sketchy then. And I remember most of them. I was to impersonate David Phipps, who was, I think, an astronomer. Although at the time I was 15 years old, and I think that they thought I might have been even younger. They liked the idea of this young boy named David Phipps who was going to be kind of a hanger-on to Dr. Timothy Leary. So I meet Timothy Leary. I'm brought to meet him by Gabriel. He's in some place, I think in Mission Hills. He's with this beautiful young woman. He had a succession of them, and I forget which one this was.
This is Joanna.
Maybe it was it still Joanna?
Yes.
Oh, she was a formidable character. I've been reading about her in this book. She was something. I didn't really see that side of her. And they roughly explained to me what they had in mind. And from there, probably a few days later, I went down to the studios of KGB where Gabriel was putting the show together. And we talked a bit, and now Timothy Leary was nothing but a gentleman to me. He was very nice. He was nice to my mother. He was very grateful that she let me hang around this notorious, acid visionary. But he didn't try to strangle me. And he tried to strangle me because I said I liked Bob Dylan. For some reason, he didn't care for me. I think he thought that Bob Dylan was too reactionary and too anti-evolution or something like that. But, you know, we got over that. That was fine. And so we had our first session of this program, and Tim's idea was to call up various scientists and ask them about higher intelligence. And so they call up the scientist, and he's coming through the speakers, and it's Carl Sagan. He must have known him from the old days or something. And so I forget how I was involved. I may have been telling Tim at the time that I was getting cosmic signals, and Tim was to interpret them. Carl Sagan didn't think this was very funny, actually. He just sort of put up with it. And I forget whether this was ever aired, but we did go through it, and I did know who Carl Sagan was at the time, and as you might expect, I thought this was pretty amazing. This sort of project culminated in a press conference that Leary gave at the El Cortez Hotel, I think during the course of the '76 convention. I was sitting at a table much like this. I'm here. I've got some sort of panel in front of me with dials on it. Timothy Leary is here. And there's the press. The press are not, they're a little skeptical about Timothy Leary, as you might expect, because of his past and his being, let out of jail. So they'd asked Timothy a question, a fairly straight-ahead question, and he'd whisper to me. I would move the dials, and I would whisper to Tim, and then Tim would say something, and it was that I was getting transmissions from outer space. The reporters did not think this was funny. They actually got more hostile as the time went on. It wasn't like a complete breakdown, but Tim would not let go of this routine. And, whatever, I was fine with it myself. I liked pranks, actually. And that's what Timothy Leary struck me as. And we spent some time after that hanging out at the El Cortez. He struck me as a prankster. And a very brilliant man, but a man that would have been like a P.T. Barnum figure in another life. And this is not to disparage his great intelligence or his visionary nature, but he had this sort of raffish kind of quality about him. But that said, he was extremely well behaved at the convention. Everybody liked talking to him. He talked to other people. He participated in a panel discussion, I remember, about science fiction. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was under the eye of his parole officer the whole time. So maybe that had something to do with his behavior. But he was fine. He was very interesting. He created his own character for himself. He was Captain or Commander Leary of the Starfleet or something. And he had a little LED light in his hat, which was not his brain glowing. It was an actual light. And he was, he was fine. One thing I will add is that his appearing there at all was controversial. I remember Shel Dorf, the person who was one of the founders of the convention, did not like the idea of Timothy Leary appearing there. And in fact, Russ Manning, the cartoonist, the comic artist who drew Tarzan, told me that the Edgar Rice Burroughs Foundation was thinking of pulling out of the convention that year because they didn't like the idea of Timothy Leary being there. And I remember a lot of us, including myself, really were strident and firm that we wanted Leary to be there. He should be there if we wanted him. I don't know if I could fully understand how people of a certain outlook would think this was very shocking, and they did, that Leary was there. But the upside was that no one was hurt, no one was compromised. He was not advertised either, so he came in, he got out, and everything was copacetic as far as I know. Now, Wendy actually went to dinner with Dr. Leary, and I'd like her to tell her story now.
Now, when Timothy Leary was on the Huntley-Brinkley report, I was in elementary school. So for me, I didn't quite understand the complete notoriety of Dr. Leary. All I know is that I was at the El Cortez, and I was drawn to a group of people sitting around the pool, and at the center of the circle was this amazing man with blue eyes that were like so electric. And we started talking, and as used to happen at Comic-Con in the early days, people talked about dinner plans and you know, where would you want to go, and blah, blah, blah. And I was invited along in this group. And so at the appointed coordinates, I showed up, and there was Dr. Leary and me. And so he said, I'm really sorry, everyone else, you know, bailed, they had other plans, is it okay? And so for a minute, I was wavering back and forth because I thought, ooh, Timothy Leary, most notorious man that I have ever heard of, you know, blah, 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 blah. And at the same time, I looked into those electric blue eyes and I felt like Chuck Yeager about to break the sound barrier. So I said, sure, let's go. And we went to the Old Spaghetti Factory, which in those days was no pictures on the menu. In the 70s, it was a very elegant hang. And I'm here to tell you that when we walked in the door, nobody really recognized him. I mean, the way that he was dressed was very casual. And we sat down to dinner, and what was interesting was he was interested in what I had to say. He wanted to know, because having been a college professor, he knew how to talk to me. I was 19 at the time. And in fact, since it was 1976, and I was turning 20 the same year that the United States was turning 200, he found that rather, when he did the math on that, he found that rather amusing. And he said, you know, what do you want to do with your life? Instead of him, you know, preening and being the star, he was actually interested in what I had to say. And, you know, I found this to be yet another example of Comic-Con in the early days mentorship. I mean, here was somebody, no problem. Here was somebody that, you want me to keep talking? I'll just keep talking. Here was somebody that, in the same tradition of Comic-Con mentorship in the early days, wanted to hear about my life. What do I want to do?
Hold just a second, sorry.
And those amazing electric blue eyes that he had that were interested in me. I mean, it was like, you know, it was like we were the only two people in the room. He just had something about him that was so amazing. And I kept thinking to myself, here I am at dinner with Timothy Leary. You know, I better not look away from my plate for too long. You know, I might find something more in my drink than a straw. And so it was, as Barry described, he was lovely, on his best behavior. I think the biggest thing for him was the fact that he was going to ask me if I was interested in ordering wine. And of course, I was 19, and that was how that whole conversation happened. And so he ordered a glass of wine. That was the strongest thing, and, you know, something with red sauce. At any rate, as the conversation progressed, and he was asking me about what I was interested in, and me trying to figure out my life, and the fact that Comic-Con was actually having a huge change, creating a huge change in my life, because I was going into a science direction, and Comic-Con was making me realize that people can have a career, you know, that is something that any of you might have been influenced by. You know, that people can have a good career in the arts. You know, it's not just something that, you know, very, very, very talented people can do that are very, very lucky. I mean, it's, you know, well, we're all very lucky to have had that experience. At any rate, as he was paying the check, I realized I'm out with the most dangerous man in America, and nobody knows where I am. So I excused myself, and I went to the ladies' room, and in those days, no cell phone, so I had to pay telephone, and I'm crouching into the wall because, you know, there's all these women gathered around, and I didn't want to say, I'm having dinner with Timothy Leary, so I didn't want to call my parents because I wasn't certain how they would respond. So I called my best girlfriend, and she wasn't home, so her father answered, and he was a professor at San Diego State. And I said, Daddy Deaton, I'm having dinner with Timothy Leary. And he said, oh yeah, tell me another one, honey child. And so I said, no, really, he's at Comic-Con, And if you want to meet him, he's going to be at the brunch. He's going to be at the brunch on Sunday at the El Cortez. And of course, Comic-Con had been on the news, and he said, well, then let me get a pencil. I gave him the information, you know, and it all worked out. In fact, it was that brunch where, you know, with the reporters and everything like that. But at any rate, I'm here to say that it changed my life in the sense that one of the most important things he said to me was, do you realize how lucky you are to be your age? You can have anything you want in the world. All you have to do is just reach out and grab it. And so that was the first time that anyone had, as an adult, had said that to me. I mean, you always have the encouraging teachers, you always have the encouraging parents, but to have somebody that was of such celebrity say that to me and look at me with those blue eyes, and I just believed what he said, and that's why I'm here today. That's not the only reason, but he had a profound effect, and he was a complete gentleman.
Would you might care to superimpose Timothy Leary's intimate conversation with Wendy with this intimate conversation he had when he was in Folsom Prison with Charles Manson. It was apparently one cell away, where they talked about the nature of good and evil and whether mankind was doomed or whether mankind would ascend. So that puts a little edge on the sort of situation that Wendy found herself in. Dave, you had also an encounter with the doctor.
Oh yeah, well, I had an ongoing interest in Dr. Leary and his writing for quite a number of years, and had read The High Priest, which is a very fine early autobiographical account in terms of meetings with various people who were a great influence in the 60s, from Aldous Huxley and Allen Ginsberg and Arthur Kessler, a whole diverse group of people, and what happened when they introduced them to psychedelics. This was in the scientific research days when he held a position at Harvard University. And this was what they were doing at the time was a legitimate inquiry. And a collection of essays, A Politics of Ecstasy, and some other things. He wrote co-wrote with some of the people from Harvard a book called The Psychedelic Experience that was an adaptation of the Evan Spence translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead to be used as a guide in the psychedelic experience. And another one, a favorite of mine, called Psychedelic Prayers, which is an adaptation of the Tao Te Ching, the great Taoist 5,000 character classic. So I had a collection of things and was interested in his writing, and the day I was at the Comic-Con, because I'm a founding member of the Comic-Con, I went every year, and that year, Jack Dickens came up to me, owner of the Comic Kingdom, who I worked for on and off, and he said, oh, I got this, I found this in a bookstore and I thought of you, and he hands me a copy of the Harvard Review, 1962, I think it was, on drugs in the mind. It's the last thing Leary published as an academic, and it was an entire issue devoted to psychedelics. And right after they said, Leary is here. And so I went up into one of the ballrooms at the Cortez, and there he was, and I went up and introduced myself, and I showed him my book, and he signed it for me. I meant to bring it today, and I got lost, left it home in the shuffle, but he said, to David, congratulations on a great archaeological find. And we talked a bit and kind of hit it off, and after the convention, he invited me to come to his house, which was in the kind of South Mission Hills area, and I met Joanna was there, and Joanna's mother was living in the house. And I talked with them, and he published a book called What Does Woman Want? And which was his current book. And it was published by Green Tiger Press here in San Diego. He did a 5,000 copy edition. By the way, I would say I was in the book trade at the time. So anyway, they had this book, and he was promoting the book. And I knew a bunch of local booksellers, and I said, I think I could probably help place some copies of these. And one of the places I placed them was on top of the piano in the house in Hillcrest that I shared. A gentleman sitting right over there, Bill Paul, another Comic-Con founding figure. And people that came into our house would see this display of the Timothy Leary book. And I sold about 25 copies off of the piano in my house, and which I thought was very interesting. And then one day I was walking along 4th Avenue in Hillcrest, and I saw Joanna very distressed, and her mother was in the hospital in the final stages of cancer and was dying of cancer. And then I think they split. She and Tim split up. Tim moved to Los Angeles, and then through Gabriel Wisdom, who I knew, and some other people, I would get invited to, when Tim would come to town to do speaking engagements. And so we would get together. I had dinner with him. He and what's his name? The L5 Society. O'Neill, not Jerry Purnell, the guy who wrote the book on L5, on the space colonies. Because Tim was talking about three things: intelligence increase, life extension, and space migration. Or actually, reverse around it. The acronym was SMILE: space migration, intelligence increase, and life extension. And so he was very interested in that space stuff, and had a very interesting evening in a restaurant listening to these guys talk about space exploration. So that's kind of my encounter with Tim. He impressed me with his extreme intelligence. He was very quick and would adapt to anyone who sat down to talk to him. Like Wendy, what you were talking about, that focus and really listening is something that he did extremely well. In his professional days in the 50s, he was a head of a team that devised a personality assessment test, which was known for many years and used, called the Leary. And Tim told me a kind of a fun story. When he was abducted by the CIA and brought back to the United States, quite without any treaty backing them up, illegally abducted and brought to the United States. One of the first things that they tried to do in the federal prison system is show that maybe he had brain damage or something from his involvement with psychedelics. And they gave him a battery of tests. And the creativity test that they gave him, they came back startled, and he had got the highest score that they'd ever seen on it. And he said, well, you should note that on the front page, the name of this is what is commonly called in the trade as the Leary. I wrote this test. Which I think is that's a great story. You know, his interrogators, picture the Hieronymus Bosch painting Ecce Homo, and his federal interrogators, and there he is, you know, kind of gently tossing that back into their teeth. And but he really was a real gentleman. Always a pleasure to talk to. He was a funny guy. He came and did a stand-up comedian routine. He was doing a stand-up philosopher. And the last time I ever saw Tim was at the comedy club in La Jolla. And I went to see a performance, and then after, Barbara, I think her name was his current lady, and I don't know if they married or not. But my last sight that I saw of Tim was walking away in La Jolla, arm in arm with Barbara, a woman that he loved, and thinking, that's a good memory for a guy who has been put through hell by a lot of people who labeled him the most dangerous man on the planet and all this. These are people representing vested interests and trying to demonize him. And he was a real human being with the good and bad qualities, pluses and minuses, but he was certainly no demon. And he was one of the greatest men that I've ever had the pleasure to meet. And I've met a lot of very interesting people in my life. So that's what I have to say about Tim.
Nice.
So can you tell us about working with Tim?
Does this work better for you?
Yeah.
Take it.
Hello. Well, I was 26 in 1976, and I had moved from upstate New York out to Los Angeles because I wanted to do underground comic books. And I met George DiCaprio, and George was Leonardo's father. Leonardo was like 2 at the time. Who knew, right? Screaming kid was going to be what he'd become. But George DiCaprio, I wish he was here because George was the guy who arranged me to do this Timothy Leary comic book. And I also wish Ron Turner was here because he could tell you his Last Gasp published it, and I don't know the behind the scenes of how the comic book was decided that it was going to be made. But anyway, George knew me, and he knew I needed work, and I was new to town, and George was a wonderful guy, and he always looked out for cartoonists and introduced people and would give people work, and I could go on about George for a long time. But he asked me if I wanted to do it, and I said, of course. And I didn't know more about Timothy Leary than anybody in America would know from what you saw on the news and whatever. I did myself only take drugs once, but it was for 17 years, so I kind of liked what he was into. And anyway, then he had all these books, and so we met and we said, well, what's the comic book gonna be? I mean, what am I doing? What are we trying to do here? And everything was neurotransmitters and all that. So I said, well, what about neurocomics? And I was like, sure. And they said, yeah, okay, that's good. And we put and this is a copy of the cover, and this is Barbara and him as these sort of space people. I guess we could pass this around or something if anybody wants, so you can see it. But yeah, Neurologic was a book. So Neurocomics was an obvious sort of, well, why not that? But we put his name on the cover big because, that would, they thought, sell books. And anyway, I've been thinking about much to say about this or how the hell to say it, but the concept was the space migration, intelligence increase in life extension had to do with evolution. And the simplest idea was that we are only halfway evolved from where we started to where we're going at this point in evolutionary history. And DNA is God. DNA is the guiding genius, intelligence, life form of the universe. And it uses different bodies. It uses amoebas and lizards and fish and humans and all living things to express itself and to grow and have fun. And so the idea was that life is born on planets in the ocean, in the water, as single cell things, and then they become more complex, and then eventually life is born from the womb of the ocean out onto the land. And then DNA says, oh, you're on the land now, you need muscles, you need skeletons, you need to change and evolve and grow. And the idea was, this related to the growth of the human embryo, from a fertilized egg to an embryo, to being born from the womb of the woman, which is like the womb of the ocean on the planet. And then when the baby is born, it has to learn how to grow and stand and move and evolve, and physical changes occur. And then aging has to happen so that, because everything lived forever, we never get anywhere, and the planet, everything would overpopulate. So when people leave the Earth and live in space, the idea went that DNA would go, oh, we're in a new place now, we've reached this phase, let's kick in and new developments will occur. And he made this whole zodiac of, from the zodiac that we have to Virgo 2 and Pisces 2 and all that stuff. So I started adapting. I said, okay, so I read the books, and he didn't get involved in the direct writing of the comic, but we would go and meet with him. And he was always really funny and really jolly and really high, it seemed to me. George and I went to his house, and I had some of the first pages of the comic book, and we were trying to say, well, what do you think? How do you like it? Oh, yeah, that's great. Hey, this is the Giants versus so-and-so on TV or some football game he was watching, and we're like, yeah, but what you like what we're doing? Oh, yeah, it's great, it's great. And then the TV set was all screwy. The green grass was purple. The colors were all messed up. And I said, I guess he doesn't know, or he doesn't care. Maybe he likes it that way. I don't know. But we only had a few meetings, and it was always a lot of fun. And he just encouraged us doing. He didn't want to get all hands on and start digging with stuff. He just let me do whatever I wanted to do. The problem is that if you ever actually looked at the comic book, about halfway through it gets so esoteric and so crazy and so far out, not crazy, but far out, to where what do you draw pictures of? I don't know what to do. I mean, because it just got to where it's like his words were the only thing that had any substance. And I mean, I drew everything I could think of, but we just got to the point. So the latter half of the comic book, I was sad because it sort of degenerated, quote unquote, into just quoting the words. Because, we would do a frame and whatever image I could, but I couldn't really think of how the hell to draw all the stuff he was talking about. But anyway, it was really a fun thing to do, and I don't know how many people, he seemed pleased with it. I think he liked having a comic book out, and just the fun of doing a comic book was the charge for him. But I had a great time doing it.
Did the comic sell appreciably?
I have no idea.
Was it in print long?
I think it only had one printing, and I think they still sell, they still can buy it from Last Gap, so, yeah,
A collector's item?
I suppose.
The completists. Yeah, yes. George, what experiences or thoughts about Dr. Leary do you have?
I'd be happy to tell you.
Okay.
I'll get this microphone close enough. Like the man said, I'm George Clayton Johnson. I had already succeeded at television. I had written a lot of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone shows, and I was an old hand at the Comic-Con and all that stuff. And I was feeling fairly prosperous. I got a phone call one afternoon from a man who identified himself as Pierre Kahn, who was an agent at William Morris Agency. And then I subsequently learned very quickly that Pierre was a cousin to James Caan, the actor. So I started to take him seriously. What's the plan? Well, the plan, he represents Timothy Leary, and there was some thought that if they put Timothy Leary and me together, they might get some energetic television. And I thought that made an awful lot of sense because I'd been following Tim's career as a fugitive from justice. He had fled the country, the FBI was after him, and deals were being made to get him back in the country. And then here he is back in the country, and here's this Pierre saying, Timothy Leary. Well, like everyone else, this is a world-class guy. I'm thinking, my God, George, this is, talk about opportunity. This is really an opportunity if Tim's at all interested in working with you. And it'd be interesting to find out what you guys talk about. So I drove my car up to Wonderland Mountain, Wonderland
Avenue.
Avenue,
Yeah,
where there was a nice large house with smoke coming out of the chimney. And I was taken into this large, fairly gracious living room with a big fireplace where there were 3 or 4 or 5, because the numbers changed, people. And a few moments later, Timothy Leary. Well, Leary came out, greeted me, and sort of laid down in front of the fireplace. So I went over and I sat by him, and we began to have a conversation. Well, what should we talk about? Do you have any ideas? I have some ideas. Let's talk about this. So we started to talk. As we talked, I began to notice an annoying habit that Timothy had. I had collaborated with others before, and I'd always regarded collaboration as an encounter, as a adversarial relationship, because sometimes you have to tell the other guy his ideas are dumb, and what he wants to do is silly, and it can get pretty damn heated if you really care about what you're trying to do, and you don't want to just say yes because the guy's an important guy and let him guide the conversation. I never could do that. So I was trying to talk to Timothy, but every time I would say something to him that was at all controversial, he would laugh in a charming way and turn to his companion who was near him and say to the guy, he has a great many opinions, doesn't he? And he would never talk to me directly. You have a great many opinions, don't you? No, he's talking to the interpreter. And I try to talk to him, and he talks to his friend, and I try to talk to him, and he talks to his friend, and his friend talks back to me and tries to do his job, which is to explain Timothy to me, or to at least be someone that Timothy could somehow place me in the third person. And I resented it. So I said to him, this isn't going to work, because in collaboration, I don't want to do it with this guy, I want to do it with you. You know, what ideas do you have? Well, this began what turned into a fairly dismal evening. Timothy went into his bedroom, came back carrying 2 decks of playing cards. One of them was the tarot, and one was the ordinary common card deck. He had cut pictures out of Playboy magazine while he was in jail, and they gave him some glue, and he pasted these pictures, after cutting them appropriately, onto his tarot cards. And I was rather taken with them as I started to look through them. I saw, for example, that the 5 of diamonds showed a small boy playing marbles with his tongue between his teeth as he's about to take a shot. And I've done that. I mean, I've been there. And I looked at that, and it made me wonder. I said, Timothy, do you think that these pictures, photos, that you got randomly out of Playboy accurately depict the meaning of that particular card? And he said, a number of them, yeah, I think so. But meanwhile, all this was going secondhand, back and forth through this. So finally I called him on it. I said, Tim, we can't do this. You got to talk to me. Don't talk to that guy and then he transfer. I hear you talking. He doesn't need to be in the room because I know what you just said. Because you said it to him to say to me. Let's get rid of all that crap, because if we're going to collaborate on something, you can't do that. Well, with what I had not taken into account, he later, on another occasion, explained it to me, was that he had just been in fear of his life from the FBI. And he was questioned incessantly, and there was, after a while, about the only way he could deal with that was to distance himself from direct encounter, because he might get slapped right in the face by one of those cops. They could very well do it if he got it all stiff with them. So he said to me, don't you think there has been some diminishment of my, at a later date he said that to me. But at the time I didn't take that into account so much, because very little alters my behavior. I'm going to be the same guy. If you don't like it, well, let's not talk, let's go somewhere else. And that was sort of the stiffness that grew between us. And so I went home wondering what the hell I just did to screw up my chances to do a series with a notable like Timothy. But at the same time, I was thinking about those goddamn cards. Because one of the last things I said to him, I said, I think you got a series there. Now, I will digress for just a moment to talk about cards, because that's important to this discussion. The ordinary deck of playing cards is an esoteric document that started in about the 14th century, several hundred years after the tarot. And it started in Spain and it spread all through Europe. And of the pictures on the playing cards have become traditional, so that the King of Hearts is always holding his sword behind his head, and the Jack is clutching at something and his fingers are going through it, because it's not wrapped around. The drawing is so stylized. And I'm looking at these damn playing cards and wondering what it was that generated this interest of Timothy's in the cards. And I started to dream and think about them, and it suddenly struck me that, my God, for one thing, they're a calendar. There are 52 weeks in a year, and there are 52 cards. And there's the Joker, and that's the Ancient of Days, the leap year part of it. And it's got 4 suits, and that's air, earth, fire, and water. Or it's the subconscious mind with diamonds, and the thinking mind with spades, and the body and its sensations with the clubs, and the emotions with the hearts. And the hearts and the clubs, and the diamonds and the spades, they intersect in a way that forms a form of completion, in the sense of the Jungian archetype of what man is. Is man 4 beings? The body, it doesn't ask permission to, when it has to pee, it has to pee. I just have to pee. It's not intellectual. It's the body is calling the shots in certain areas. The brain calls the shots in certain areas. The imagination calls the shots, and so do the emotions. And so I began to organize them. And I could see that diamonds was a child, that the club was an adolescent, that the spade was an adult, and that the hearts represented parenthood, or something where you had a greater interest than in yourself. You had an interest in a child, and the emotions and all that stuff. The more I looked at the card deck, 1 is activity, 2 is union or dispute, 3 is completion, 4 is order, 5 is change, 6 is harmony, 7 is mystery, 8 is domination, and 9 is the feminine principle. Receptivity. And so these meanings are implicit in the numerological meanings of these cards. And the more I looked at that, I began to realize some of the reasons why some playing cards that I had encountered had nicknames. The Queen of Hearts is known as the beautiful thief. The Queen of Diamonds is the lover's treasure. The Four of Clubs is the devil's bedpost. You see this, you hear this when you play poker, when you talk to card people. There's a tradition in those cards that makes those cards a group of people who represent all possible human relationships. You got 13 varieties of club. You got 13 varieties of diamond. And they go and they ascend in such a way that before long I was making lists of the ace of diamonds is this, the ace of, now how to do the twos, then how to do the threes, and how to do the fours. And before long I had this thing all put together, and I called it the Devil's Picture Book. And I saw a very powerful teaching, learning tool in it if it were interpreted the way my mind was beginning to see it. I spent years working on it, and I have a pilot story for it called Old Doc Cutler and the Story of Devil in the Stream. And it's a story-making tool. I showed it to Jack Kirby sometime later. I wanted his advice on what I thought was a game. He said, you don't have a game. You have something else, but games have winners and losers. And there's no winners or losers the way you got it set up. So how can it be a game? And I realized what kind of a game it was a story-making game. That if you laid the cards out in a certain ritualized way and considered that the heavens chance was giving you an opportunity to see some blazingly exciting story in that array of cards as you try to understand the motives. The story is about the center card in a 9-card layout, and that you had diamonds dominating one corner and clubs another and spades another, and it formed a hierarchy and all of these things. And I could see that as a tool, if one were to engage with 4 other people, it would work perfectly over the internet. 4 people in different countries could collaborate to make a story that would have exciting characters in it, because all potential characters are in those 52 cards. And the Joker, which is it's wild. You know, the more I knew about it, the more I thought about it. So I really learned a great deal from Timothy. I tried to talk to him about it later. I met him at the Comic-Con. I met him at some other building where he had been invited, and I found I had been invited to. And I had 3 or 4 more encounters with Timothy along the way, including the Comic-Con, where I was on a panel with he and Theodore Sturgeon. And the audience of fans were interested to know, the way they'd set this panel up, was what advice did each of us, did we think was important to know about? Theodore Sturgeon said, a little indignation. When the gangbanger starts riding on the inside of the bus and creating a mess, somebody's got to get upset about it and say, what the hell are you doing? But nobody does. They all are afraid that the guy with the pin in his head marking up the bus is dangerous. And so they don't reprove him. So a little indignation. If we really had some of that, a lot of the crap would go out of society, and everybody would applause, applause, applause. And each of us had our ideas about what to do. At the time, I was very involved with a concept that's almost too difficult to try to explain it here. And it may be well that I've forgotten half of it. But anyway, I was working away and found myself on the panel with these guys. And so I tried to talk about this system of organization, which to a large extent derived from my study of the deck of cards and of Timothy's doing these deck of cards, and me trying to find the real face of each of these cars and why they're called what they're called. So I ended up labeling all the cars and making indexes. I spent years trying to find a place to sell the pilot for a series that is a very revealing and storytelling mode, and have access with it. But along the way, I have thought about Timothy Leary an awful lot. He was what they said. He was the most dangerous man around. His brain was filled with thinking. He had had more goddamn acid trips than you can think of, and I've had a few of those, and I know how much profoundly they change your understanding of everything. Because when you're sitting in a room and suddenly the wall takes a breath, spins perfectly as it is taking that breath, and then slowly subsides back into position, and you look at it with your eyes and you say, that cannot be a figment of my imagination, it's too detailed. I look at every little molecular part of that wall, and it's taking a goddamn breath. And enough adventures like that in reality that you look at a carpet and you watch the fibers crawling around and talk about it. It is an insane thing, but it's not insane. I know that it's true. That what I'm looking at is, in spite of everything that I'm thinking, there's a great truth going on here. And so I think I've learned a great deal from psychedelics. And I was very much caught up with Alvin Toffler, who talked about it in Future Shock, the idea that we need to have a new form of relatedness in order to be able to make the decisions we need to be able to go safely into the future. And that we couldn't make decisions with committees and groups and trios and judges and things like that because there are too many terribly important decisions to make. You know, how much corn should we plant this year? That sort of information gets out there. And there's years they don't plant the corn because they got plenty of it in all their grain silos. And somebody made that decision in that area, and people followed the decision. And up until that time, most of the decisions that had been made had not been catastrophic. There had been some that were really in rotten shape, but more often than not, our decision making had been pretty effective. But Alvin Toffler said, no, we have to rise to a new level of relatedness, and almost miraculously, the internet showed up, the World Wide Web. And I can't think of anything that makes everybody in the world relate to each other differently than that particular tool. So back to Timothy. Timothy was a victim of the system. And it was largely because, like myself, he found psychedelics useful, tremendously useful. They were a tool that was being ignored because it was being manufactured illegally by people who didn't want to give their names, and that you had to know somebody who knew somebody to get your hands on some of it, and you could get in terrible danger from the law if you were found with it. And Timothy had been up against that. I understood it perfectly. And I'm really sorry that I didn't use more patience and try and find another way to get him into a mode to where I could safely tell him he was wrong without killing the deal. But because I had to be in that position, else I would feel helpless, and I would be the victim because I would be turning my thinking over to somebody else, and I refused to do that. So my story is that I liked Timothy Leary. I recognized those beautiful blue eyes of his. The only guy who's got shinier blue eyes than him is Frank Sinatra. When Frank Sinatra looked at me with those eyes of his, I melted. I didn't know what the hell to do. There's something insanely intelligent behind those eyes. And probably just because he had the confidence to know that he was probably one of the best singers in the world at the time. You know, and that will give your spirit a lift to know you're the best at something. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions if somebody has any for anyone on the panel. Yes.
Here's one.
Okay.
There was a cartoon in the comic book where Timothy Leary's standing at a butcher counter with the brain sliced up like a big bologna. And I was wondering, was that your idea or was that his?
You know what, that was George DiCaprio's
Oh,
idea.
okay.
And one page.
Yes.
I admit I do not know when he died, but what did he experience of the computer and web as we know it today? I mean, what year did he die?
Dave,
He's on the web.
yes. Did
Yeah.
he pass
96.
away around, yes, what I thought, yes. Yes.
What year?
96.
According to Wikipedia.
So sort
He
of.
saw the internet and all of that, and was enthusiastic. Had a web presence.
So having seen the internet, which was something he was sort of suggesting, what was the next thing he was thinking about?
Well, the internet's kind of a macro extension of the nervous system. It's the linking up of nervous systems and minds all over the world via this network.
I've been thinking about this a while, and you know, everyone talks about the brain having fibers and visual center and this. Someday they're going to realize the brain is wireless.
Exactly. Mind is not brain.
So but no, even the brain itself is wireless.
Yes, but beyond that, what is mind? This is even bigger than brain.
To be able to think about that, I'll comment on that. To be able to think about that, I invented a phrase. I wrote an essay called Writing for the Jew, and the subtitle of that essay is The Great Telephone Mind Space in the Sky. Because there is a great telephone mind space in the sky, and it's being filled with data. It's growing every day, much of it on the internet, but a lot of it just through quantum leaps in knowledge about stuff. You know, we use cement a certain way, and then somebody looks at cement in a fresh way, and we start using it that way, so we start using it another way. That sort of thing is out there. It's in the atmosphere. It's the great mind space in the sky. I use the word telephone because it's very intimate. It's like talking to your mother or somebody on the telephone. She knows you, you know her, and that business of we know who everybody is, and we know who the liars are. They've revealed themselves. That's all coming. It's an important thing to be able to be one who contributes to the mind space. Like those Twilight Zone episodes, they've lasted 50 years and they're still running them. Still running them. Because Rod Serling was very, very aware of what he was doing when he brought the whole question of fantasy into being. He was the guy who won all the Emmys for being super logical, for writing mainstream, non-fantasy stuff like Patterns and shows like The Requiem for a Heavyweight. They were photogenic fiction. They were very readable, but they were scripts. Script is different from a story. The story tells you about something. A script shows you something. It takes a very special discipline to transfer a story into screenplay form and keep the power, the power, the pride, and the produce of Fresno. You know, anyway, there's my idea about that.
But the question wasn't about transmission of mind. The question was, what is mind? And I think that's more fundamental.
Do you have a suggestion as to what that might be? What is mind?
I do.
You know, we have
Abhidharma.
we have about 2-3 minutes left, so that's a weighty topic, unfortunately. But anybody that wants to contribute something is fine at this point.
There's a school in Mahayana Buddhism, Abhidharma, and it's the mind-only school. And it says that ultimately everything is mind. Well, we agree that there's this world out there. Where does it live? It lives in mind. Other than mind, it has no existence. And Mahayana is the kind of the ultimate statement or growth of Buddhism and the state of mind only. And I think this points to mind only.
I don't know if this
It goes beyond
applies.
physicality.
I don't know if this applies, but Captain Beefheart, Don Van Vliet said, "What is the largest mammal in the world? The absent mind." I can't argue with that. One last question.
Well, are we not all isn't that kind of what Timothy Leary was saying? We are always interconnected because we are all part of this. And part of us now is growing in that direction, maybe we hope, instead of another direction where it's, greed and fighting and stuff.
There's the three poisons.
I know this much, if I tried
Delusion.
to describe a mind to one of you, unless you had one, there's no way that you know where I'm going.
And as Dan Quayle said, the mind is a terrible thing to lose. And he will end it up.
Well, I knew Dan Quayle.